I have always perceived as the religion of the Abrahamism to have emerged out of the political wills. There was not much of a spirituality related to the idea. Spirituality was always an added factor. And of all, Islam was definitely a faith which actually, in my opinion, didn't exist till 7th of the century. And it started, though the idea was being cooked up since 4th century, but it emerged into a full-fledged religion, and it was the Abbasids who formulated it in a very right and not right in an appropriate way how the Islam needs to be spread, or the kind of the you submit to someone. This was brought out by Abbasids, in my opinion, because Abbasids had actually burned down all the literature of the Umayyads as well. We have the records for it, and Abbasids were the one who were just manufacturing hadiths like how weapons are being manufactured during the war. More the war, the more the hadiths were produced, and and at the same time, this story of this bin Qasim of the Sindh also comes from there. It was commissioned to for the first time we hear of bin Qasim in 895 AD, or rather about the story of the Sindh, which is 180 years after the alleged strike by the 17-year-old juvenile boy. Letting people know about the subject which we are going to discuss about. So I will just do a bit of revision on to what we discussed last time and how actually the models are have been framed into. So the idea about knowing the Islam and how it originated came to my mind from the fact that we all see that there's a lot of things happening around, and somehow, especially in the subcontinent, the idea is basically being to talk about Muhammad, to talk about the humiliation of Islam. But I do believe that we never went to the core or root of it to understand that why exactly the problem lies. Because even the literature, what we are referring to, criticize Islam, or set a historical narrative about it, that itself is not a true one, right? Because we talk about Quran and then say that Muhammad came and destroyed all the idols, but this is not a historical incident. This is just a cooked up story. That is what the primary sources say. And at the same time, what happens is that when we perhaps I spoke last time that in fact Muhammad bin Qasim never came to India. That story was also fabricated one, and the whole thing got glorified largely through Chachanama in the 13th century. So 500 years after down the line, someone looks to speak about someone called Bin Qasim, a 17-year-old guy who defeated the mighty Sindh. So these all stories were cooked up, and these all were happening during the Abbasid period. So there's a lot around, and all those quests led me to really rethink about how exactly Islam is, how it has been performing, what have been the changes, right? So those things intrigued me to look into. Last time we discussed a lot about what exactly are the red flags of the Islam, like what really makes person think that we need to rethink about Islam. And I always use a term called SIN, that is sin, which is standard Islamic narrative, which we get to know that Muhammad was born in this and this year, and then he goes to Mount Hira, and the revelations come, and then from Makkah he goes to Medina, Medina he comes to. So this is a standard narrative which we have been fed based on certain literature, that is Quran and the Hadith, but we never inquired when those literature were written, right? Because it's very important to understand that if a literature is written after 200 years from the demise of a man, say Muhammad in this case, then it's a red flag that what happened for 200 years, why you didn't took a heed to write about him. So those things led me to relook into it, and I have proposed a new concept with a new idea of old Islamic narrative, and I call it AIT, which was used popularly in India for Aryan invasion theory, and my AIT is alternative Islamic theory. That what exactly the theory of Islam or how it really originated, like is supposed to be. So I will just start sharing my screen because I have collated few of the slides that will lead people to understand the things more holistically. This is what I'm calling it. AI, this is AIT2 because it's the second talk of the session. And previously, we spoke about how the earlier Qiblas were facing towards Petra and not Mecca. And we looked at how we need to question Hadith and why question arises that they are not authentic. And there are many things which we discussed last time. So I will not go much into detail because there's a lot to discuss, and I don't know how much time we will have today. So, to begin with, I need to pass on few ideas about how actually theologies were working in the Middle East. And just to give a perspective, I came to know that Telegiri is also gonna give a talk where he will talk about Dasrajan War and Battle of the Ten Kings and the context of Rig Veda. And actually, it was that battle, and further one more battle happened, which led to a lot of migration out of India. The people migrated outside, and then Avestan text was also written. So Avestan text was very much inspired by the Indian text Rig Veda, and they actually were the people who were the Indians. They migrated outside, and then a new faith was created, which was Zoroastrianism, right? So the Zoroastrianism was largely based on the idea which was grabbed from the Indic ideas. And actually, the fight which happened in the past was also on the theological base that there's a collision of idea. This is not right, and all those kind of things. And when the Zoroastrianism happened, and many people would believe that it's a straightforward monistic religion, and there's nothing about yoga. They didn't believe in cyclic time and all those kind of things. But actually, the Zoroastrians also did had a concept of yoga where they had, they shortened it out to around 12,000 years in the gaps of 3,000, 3,000, like that. And gradually from further, it came down to, it was first monoism, then monotheism, and then further from monotheism, we got the emergence of the Abrahamic ideas. And from Abrahamic idea, we got Yahwahism to start with. Right now, we are seeing that a lot is happening in Israel and Palestine, right? And there's a claim that perhaps Palestine are the original people and the Israelis are the outsiders. But this region was known as a Canaan region long back, and those people first adopted the Yahwahism. Yahweh was the god of the, and so when Yahwahism came, they didn't negate the rest of the god. They believe that Yahwahism, Yahweh is the primary god, but they still believe that other gods also exist. So for a particular house or for a particular group of people, Yahweh is the lead. And from Yahwahism, we finally came to the Judaism, or the Jews came into picture, right? Where Yahweh became the primary god and all other gods were negated. And further on, the religions kept on popping, and then we saw the idea of Christianity emerging. And when Christianity emerged, further there were a lot of fights and brawls among them in terms of that how they perceive Jesus as. So people were not very clear, or rather, I would say that they didn't had a very set direction. They were always colliding ideas. So, a few terminology which I wish that people must understand is that what Arianism is, what is Trinitarianism, who were the Melkite, and who were the Chalcedonian people, or a definition which was given to the Chalcedonian people. So, all these four definitions, what I have put across, will actually make us understand that how this Christianity, or the clash among the Christians and the ideas adopted from the Jews, led to the creation of the faith what we today know as Islam. Moving forward, I've just put it across. So Arianism is a Christological doctrine which attributed to Arius, a Christian professor in Alexandria, Egypt. Arian theology holds that Jesus Christ, the Son of God. In a Trinitarianism, perhaps I'm sure everyone is aware about it. The Melkite idea was very much in the line of Chalcedonian definition that Jesus is perfect both in deity and the humanness. So there's a dual nature for the Jesus, what they perceived, right? And if you see that the idea of Arianism kind of relates very much with what exactly is a becomes the primary concept of the Islam too. Of it was all about not seeing Jesus as the God. That is how it begins with in Islam. This is what. So, as per the standard Islamic narrative, the Umayyad leaders of the early caliphates were among the families that had originally followed the Prophet Muhammad. This is the narrative which is given to us. And if we see, uh, this these are the various caliphate reasons. So, under Muhammad, it is said that it was this was the reason which was occupied. Then under the under six from 632 to 661, this lighter orange, or rather the orange patch, is what was conquered, and the green, the yellow one, the chrome yellow, is where the Umayyad Caliphate was in play. And it's said that they were the first family to have got converted to Islam. So, and so, what the modern Muslims, if you ask to any modern Muslim, they would always say that the political policy should be based on the Umayyad role model. It is said that was so successful that perhaps poverty had been eliminated and not a single individual could be found to accept the zakat. So the whole idea was that everything was very wealthy. So hence it becomes very important to know that how Umayyads converted to Islam. So if we really crack down on it, then it will really decode the truth of Islam, or rather how it actually happened. So moving forward, and so many scholars always have had an opinion that Umayyad had converted to Islam, and it happened with the consensus that they just readily moved into Islam. And I have followed the similar approach of the classical narrative, and I have mixed it with the primary sources. So I have picked the scholarly works which have not actually shied off to show that Syro-Aramic Christian background exists in the Quran. The understanding of the mechanism, and the interaction of the Judaic religions still, kind of will give idea that the mixture of those literature was making the Quran come into play. And there's one organization which I do follow, and their works are some really marvelous. It's the Inara Institute for Research on the Early Islamic History and Quran. They basically do the study on the early Islam and the Quran. And so the quote, what you see in the front, has been cited to Christoph Luxemburg, who is actually a research member there. He says that Quran intended itself first of all to be understood as nothing more than a liturgical book with selected texts from scriptures, the Old and the New Testament, and not at all as a substitute for the scripture themselves. That is an independent scripture. So it means he is making a very bold claim that Quran is combination of the works of the Old and the New Testament. And so, if I look at further assertions of Luxembourg, so he states that Friday prayer, according to him, Friday prayers come from the repositioning of the Christian Good Friday. The sacred symbols at the beginning of number of the surahs have Syro-Aramic church origin. So, in the beginning of every surah, the sacred symbol which are put are Syro-Aramic church origin. This is the revelation made by Christoph Luxemburg. And what they actually used to be in a Syro-Aramic text, they were actually the kind of the decoding code for the instruction that how the particular class need to be read. So that exactly process has been applied into the Quran as well. So in context of Quran, we see that Jews, Christians, and the Sabians are the partners of the people of book. And the Luxembourg also says that the Quran speaks to an audience. It is always speaking to an audience. Like when you read a Quran, you will find it's speaking to someone else, and someone needs to be a person will get to know Quran or understand Quran only if he is familiar with Torah, the Hebrew Bible, the Gospel, and the Talmud. So without knowing all this text, one cannot really understand the Quran. So it was a nichod, what we call in Indian nichod, that you take it something out and just squeeze it. So this is how actually the Quran was formulated, and this was something very interesting which I found. In general, Quran contains relatively few spiritual markers that actually can be viewed sharply as unique and new creation. So, if one who has read the Quran, one who has read the Torah, one who has read the Old and New Testament won't find anything unique in it. And the So, for example, when we examine that into the book, we see that there's an innate hatred for the of the authors of the Quran against the Samaritans, and they almost see them as a touch me not people. Right? This is what actually comes from the Old Testament, and moreover, the list of the Judaic prophets in the Quran is so pinpoint precise that there can be no doubts at all, that it has not copied the things from the Old and the New Testament. And so there's a lot of references about the earlier prophets. So now Christianity has come into being, it's existing. And if one try to recall that how Christianity was unfolding, lot of confrontation was among the people. There were a lot of debates. There were a lot of school of thoughts which were emerging with the different thoughts, and every school of thought had certain idea about Jesus Christ. So this image, what you see, has been this is the Isra who is reading the law to the people, and the first four Jewish sects from the prophet Isra should be the big, in my opinion, should be the beginning of the Islam story. So this is where, the moment people started following Isra, that is when the Islam story begins. That all those things have started turning off. And the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD served as the starting point for the Umayyads. So I'm saying that around 300 years back, the idea for the Umayyads had been established. It was already in place. We will go through things to understand it further. So what happens is that at this particular council, right? We spoke about the Nicaea Council of 325 AD. So at particular this council, Jesus had been declared divine Son of God, and Christianity was happily united. That time, everyone was very clear about it. He's Son of God, and but according to the Arian Church historian Eusebius, it was made clear that we believe in one God, the Almighty Father, one Lord Jesus Christ, the Son of the God, the only begotten of the Father. So here, what we see that there's a rejection of Jesus as a God, or consideration, because the consideration has come as a begotten Son of the God, and they also come up with the idea about the missing of the crucifixion. This is what the Arian Christology brings forth in front of us, and perhaps this is actually the seed of Islam, where you reject the crucifixion, and you also see that Jesus is the begotten. Jesus is a human being. He had nothing to do with the God. He is just like Muhammad, right? So we spoke about the Council of Nicaea, and see what we read in the Quran 38.3, 18.3, 17.111 is exactly what the Council of Nicaea was talking about. So we so the, his like Quran 38.3 is talking about an impostor, and that the book may warn that those who say God hath begotten a son, praise be to the God who hath not begotten a son, who hath no partner in the kingdom, nor any protector on an account of the weakness. So what we see is that, the idea of the Islam was set in the Council of Nicaea itself in 325 AD, which is around 310 years, or 307 years before the alleged demise of the Muhammad. So then came the Council of Antioch in 341 AD. So what it does is that it declared Jesus the man with his spirit constituting of the word of God. So the council was like a backlash against the Eastern bishop, because they had a very different school of thought, and they had declared that there is nothing spiritual about Jesus and things. So what happened that though the Nicaea was supposed to bring the unity among the Christians, so instead of that, the variations in the number of we found that there was a variation in number of the Nicene canons. So they were, even the what was discussed in the Nicaea, it was further distributed in different forms of text. The Antioch's what we're talking about, this counter edict, and Alexandria's stubborn refusal to compromise reflect a long and bloody struggle that would be in full swing at the beginning of the 7th century. So what happened between the Antioch Council, the Nicaea, and the kind of variation of the canons of the Nicias words which were being distributed. So it really set the Roman world on fire. They were kind of just into the war in the 7th century. We'll discuss it further that how this was working. After Nicaea, the Jews were expelled east, and the pre-existing Eastern Christian parties were complemented with several disparate Jewish sects of the Arch-Jewish, Judeo-Messianic, Judeo-Trinitarian, and the Rabbinic origin. So scholars do believe that the complex and often contradictory traditions are an unreliable source for historical evidences. So indeed, we need to go for the primary sources. So what I did is that now I am not referring to Islam from Quran, but I'm trying to understand that what the primary sources say about the principles of Islam. So while I'm reading it out about the Council of Nicaea, and while we talk about the Antioch, so Council of Antioch, so it becomes very clear that the foundation of Islam is being led here. The idea is, and the seed has been led over there. So the we see in Quran we have overwhelming number of surahs which talk of anti-Trinitarian concept. Quran is also talks a lot against Isra and Adam being the son of the God. They even Isra and Adam are not considered as the son of God. On the other hand, the anti-Trinitarian stance also allows for the separation of a number of sects that would undoubtedly be opponents of the Quran. So they will become the opponents of the Quran then. So it is definitely assumed that Umayyads were Muslims and that Islam's birth pains were related to the pagan remnants in Mecca. However, the current historicity appears to rest on the whitewashed order of the events that is indicative of an eagerness of the actors to be connected to the supporters of Muhammad. So this scenario ideally does not only defies human nature but also the reality of the organized religion. It really brings forth the idea that the whole thing was conspired and really made to happen in a certain way. So from the beginning, Judaism and Christianity were in a state of perpetual fragmentation that was triggered by new books and ideas. We all are aware about it. The slightest deviations in beliefs tended to lead a fire supposition. It was happening from ages. It's not nothing new, and a lot of bloodshed used to happen. And it would be naive to assume that a widespread agreement on the Quran happened started bringing the bloodshed. In fact, the Jews and the different ideas of Christianity were also leading to a lot of wars among the people. So then came the fourth communal council of the Chalcedon. So it happens in 451 AD. So now we are around 170 years before the alleged death of Muhammad. So Byzantine Orthodoxy had declared Jesus as both fully man and fully God. So the dual nature was adopted to the Jesus by now in this ecumenical council. Byzantines were determined to implement the new doctrine throughout Christianity at the sword point. So it was actually happening. So Byzantine had declared that in 451 AD they will make sure that to make people believe that Jesus is both fully man and the fully God. So it was happening on the point of sword, and this is recorded. This is recorded in the history. Now, in the 450, the Council of Chalcedon, what you see here is a Ghaznid Empire and the Lakhmid Empire. So this is close to the Roman Empire, then this is close to the Sassanid Persian Empire. So what happens is that Arianism, which we discussed initially, is a Christological doctrine which was attributed to Arius, a Christian presbyter in Alexandria, Egypt. Arian theology holds that Jesus Christ is the Son of the God, who was begotten by God and Father and is distinct from the Father. Therefore, he is subordinate to the God. He is not exactly God, but he is subordinate to the God. However, in the contrast with the traditional Trinitarianism, Arianism, because Trinitarianism has got a different view. Arianism holds that the Son is also the Son of God, but not co-eternal with God, the Father. In contrast, the term Arian is derived from the name we spoke about it, and the term now. Uh, what happens now? I'll come back to it because one side was going with the Aryan idea and one was going with the Trinitarian idea. So in the early 6th century, the Aryan Lakhmids, so these were following the concept of the Aryanism in Syria, were displaced with the help of new Byzantine ally. The while the Melkite Ghassanids, these are the Melkite people. And who were the Melkite? Melkite were originally used as a it was a pejorative term after the acrimonious division that occurred in the Eastern Christianity after the Council of Chalcedon. So just after this, a new term was introduced for a new for the idea followed by the people who agreed to the things given by the Ecumenical Council of Chalcedon. So the Ghassanids were lifted to the royal vassal kings by the Byzantine empires. So these people are made a vassal of the Byzantine Empire, while the immigrating Ishmaelites turned into the vengeful enemies from the southern Iraq, also called the Arabistan or the Hira. So they moved this side. So what happens next is that we come to 531 AD, and this is area. This time is remarkable because this is about siege of Martyropolis in 531 AD. This is 101 years, 101 years before the alleged death of Muhammad. So what we see that a siege of Martyropolis occurred in autumn of 531 during the Liberian War between the Sasanian Empire and Kavad under Kavad I. Kavad I was the ruler of the Sasanian Empire at that time in 531 AD, and the Byzantine Empire under Justinian I. So Justinian I was from the side of the Byzantine Empire; he was leading them, and Kavad I was the ruler of the Sasanian Empire. So and the siege and it happened in 531 AD. So, a Roman raid from the metropolis triggered the Sasanians to launch a siege on the newly fortified frontier city. Initially, the Sasanians had upper hand, but as a series of political events and the logistical issues led them to withdraw. The Sasanians had to withdraw. It was the last conflict of the Liberian War. The new allies of the Persia, so the Lakhmids, the new allies of the Persia, the migrated Ishmaelites, Lakhmids were lifted to the Persian royal vessel. So while Byzantine had made the Ghassanids at the royal vessel, these guys are made into the royal vessel by the Persians. They went on to help the crushing of Justinian's superior army in 531 AD, which we spoke about, and an eternal peace agreement was made. So this image is of the Justinian one, and this is of covered. It's of covered one. So somehow Justinian doesn't go very good in a history. He has got kind of a very black kind of record. When I say black, he's not very much celebrated of a person. So what does Justinian do? The decisions made Justinian subjected the church in the Byzantine Empire and in the parts of Italy to the Roman law. He had a Roman law, and what we see on the right side, it was his Roman law. He made the Chalcedonian Christianity the state religion. So the Chalcedonian Christianity had become the state religion now, and he seized the treasures of the Aryan churches. So he is siding by the Ghassanids people. So if I just go back to the slide, this is a Ghassanid empire. So they are finding the support from the Justinian, and these were the people, Lakhmids, were the Ishmaelites, who were finding the support of the Sassanid Persian Empire. The decision made by Justinian are known as Corpus Juris Civilis. After 381 AD, it was the first time when a new religion was or a new idea about Jesus was being enforced upon people at a state religion. So, as per the corpus, there were a lot of atrocities upon the Jews. The corpus, this is the corpus which I'm talking about. So, it ensured that Jews should enjoy no honors, and they had to be discriminated against in every civil and religious rights. They were forbidden to use the Hebrew language for their worship. So, we see that the Jews are being kind of crushed by this Byzantine people under the Justinian one. So Justinian terror was really massive, and it's spoken about by a lot of people. And Byzantine Empire was really there were a lot of talks about Justinian that he's doing this atrocity and like how it happens among the subjects. And under his reign, millions of Montanus, Sabbateans, Samaritans, Jews, and Aryans turned into the immigrants. So they started immigrating. So the Jews in Yemen started killing the Trinitarian Christians. So, because the Jews were being persecuted by the Justinian as per his corpus, which is called the Corpus Juris Civil. So now Jews started giving back to the Christians. So this led to the expulsion of the Jews. So once this kind of civil war happened, the Jews were further subjugated to the expulsion by the Christian neighbor, which leaded to more of a Jewish immigrants. So the Justinian, and then we come to a big thing which happened around that period, which is also called Justinian plague. It happened between 541 to 549 AD. It lasted for around 9 years, and was the beginning of the and it was one of the first oldest world pandemic of the plague, and it caused a contagious disease caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, and the disease afflicted the entire Mediterranean basin, Europe, the Near East, and it severely affected the Sasanian Empire and the Roman Empire, and especially the capital, Constantinople. So the plague is named actually after the Roman Emperor in Constantinople, Justinian I. So this was also called a Justinian I plague because, according to his own court historian, Procopius, he had contracted the disease and recovered in 542 AD. So, in kind of remembrance, this name was given to him. And also, it is said that at the height of epidemic, when it was really on the rise, he was subjecting his people to more of poverty. He was not. There were very high taxes and a lot of things were happening. So he somehow is considered to be also the engineer of the devastation in the plague. And so we see that after the Sasanian Byzantine civil wars had stopped, Persia had fought back and managed to occupy Syria. So now Persia was having the Syria, cutting the Melkite Ghassanids off from the Byzantine domain. So Ghassanids are now cut off from the Byzantine domain completely. In the confusing back and forth, the Persian and the Byzantine empires ended up forging an alliance in 591 AD. So if you see that, and now these two guys, the Lakhmids and the Ghassanids, are made fool out of because these Persian and the Byzantine just get into an alliance, and the both Melkite Ghassanids and the Lakhmid Ishmaelites lost their partners, military contract, and the prestigious royal status. So from the 7th century onward, we see that things start changing drastically. So this is called the Rome's low point, this period, and Rome had started facing a lot of devastation. So um, it's said that fundamentalism was at rise in the Rome, and around 20,000. It is said that Rome was once upon a time it was inhabiting around 1.7 million people, but now that 1.7 million had come down to 20,000. So that was a kind of purge which happened over there. Us is because of the deadly plagues, and of course a lot of civil wars and a lot of things were happening. And there is one very interesting thing that once the plague were happening, so the Pope Georgiary in the Rome had expressed his feelings that the world had come to an end. So he's saying that the world has come to an end, and it was his successor. And while he said this, this made a lot of people convert to the pagan Roman Christianity, being which was spread by the Justinian. So there's a lot of mass conversions also happened in that period. So I do believe that this had also led to a lot of transition in the faith of the people. So by the 7th century, there was a sectarian unrest during the time of Maurice, Phocas, and Heraclius had swept the entire Middle East and the Europe. Heraclius was one of a very mighty emperor of the Byzantines, and he had actually swept almost whole of a land. He was expanding like anything in that time. And the Melkite patriarchs, Melkite as in the Ghassanids, of Alexandria, Jerusalem, and Antioch seized on an opportunities and merged their churches. So what they started doing, the Melkites were now merging their churches. And John Bishop of Niku, who has written a lot about what was happening that time, did say that God was patient with those apostates and heretics that had undergone baptism a second time. That is, it means that those that fell from orthodoxy into the Muslim camp. Here, Muslim is a term which is used for the immigrants. It doesn't mean it's come from Muzahir, and that is how it happened. Muslim actually never meant by Islam that time. It was about the people who were immigrating. So because they again converted to Christianity, so that's why he's talking about this. That John Bishop Niku declared that the apostates and the heretics that had undergone baptism a second time, that is those that fell from orthodoxy into the Muslim camp, where Muslim indicates a large number of immigrants who had fled from the Byzantine territories and then rejoined Trinitarian orthodoxies. So we see that immigration was happening, but there was a time when they came back and they just accepted Christianity, which was being practiced by the state back then. And we also and the bishop Niku also makes a very interesting remark that time that a lot of immigrants were being persecuted by the the Heraclius, the emperor of the Byzantine that time. So if you could, this is the statement which I put for John Bishop Niku, and this is the reference for his saying. He clearly makes a statement that there were series of apostates and the cosmos who were delivered up in the city. Now these are denied the Christian faith and had abandoned holy baptism and had followed in the paths of the pagans and idolaters. But again, he makes a statement that they were reconverted. He has John Niku has recorded a lot of things about what was happening that time. So by the 7th century, what we see is that Arians were completely opposing the Chalcedonian formula of Jesus. So Arians and Chalcedonian stayed always poles apart. So as per the Arians and semi-Arians, Jesus was definitely a man. They never saw Jesus as a divine person that way. And the Persian emperor actually made sure that the Christians in the East remained religious enemies of the Byzantines. So the as in the it was made sure that the Lakhmids always remained like enemies of the Ghaznavids. So that was continuing. So Persian emperor made sure that this really exists. So their core would have been clustered around southern Iraq and the eastern Arab Peninsula and the Patriarch located in the Cilicia, which was in danger of the conversion by the Heraclius conquest. So Heraclius was also looking to convert the people back then. So what is very interesting that because Arians and semi-Arians were perceiving Jesus as a man, so they got a lot of support by the Persian. And when they got the support of the Persians, they started adopting the Persian customs. So this is what you see is exactly a catch that how this transition was happening. So Arians and the semi-Arians had seen Jesus as a man, and this was very much celebrated and liked by the Persians, and they were supporting them. And in return, they had started taking up the Persian culture. And this is where the we also see the foundation of the Nestorian ideas as well. So in 7th century is quite interesting because the person we have seen that as per the standard Islamic narrative, this is where whole of Islam is trying looking to spread. But when we look at actually the primary sources, because we don't have any literature from the 7th century, so we are going back to this Roman literature and what was uh, um, happening in the Byzantines, what has been recorded by the Syriac text and all those things. So what it gives is a very thrilling experience. If you ask me, that it's way more interesting than Da Vinci Code film or the book rather. So what happens? The Persian emperor killed the last Lakhmid Ismailite king in the Al Hira. So Persian emperor, though the Lakhmids were finding the support of the Persian earlier, the Persian emperor kills the Lakhmid Ismailite king in Al Hira and put Yas ibn Kabisa al Tai in the place in order to prevent the Ishmaelites from converting to the Orthodox enemy camp. So what he does is that he brings in a new guy called Iyas ibn Kabisa al Tai. This name is very important. We need to remember it because in my projection, this guy, Yas ibn Kabisa, was the one which has been projected as Muhammad. I, there are various reasons we will discuss about this as well. That why we come to this conclusion. So he did rule the Lakhmids from 602 to 611 AD, together with the Persian governor Nakijan, followed with the governor Ajad Beg in 611 to 633 AD. So if you see, if you look at the dates, so it will give you a lot of idea. It's 602 to 611, 611 to 633 AD. So just keep these dates in mind. So yes, and he was actually appointed as an interim governor initially by Hormid IV, who was the monarch of the Persia at that time. And because he always believed a lot, there's a lot of literature also available about that for why he supported Iyas ibn Qabisa and those things. We can get to know about that as well. So at some point, the Persian king Hamred has also awarded Iyas ibn Qabisa around 30 villages, along with the Euphrates as a grant and it was made sure that he controls all those 30 villages and the parts of the Euphrates to not so that they just don't convert back to the orthodox ideas of the Byzantines. So he was ensuring that. So now we also get to know that Yas ibn Kabisa is a very important name per se, because the first reference to Muhammad, if you ask anyone that what is the proof of Muhammad, and the first reference what people will give is what is a text from 636 AD, which is lying in a British library, and it talks about Muhammad. It talks about the Tayaye of Muhammad. It is talking about it is about a battle which was fought in 634 AD at the Gaza Strip, where the things are going on right now, and it talks about Muhammad di Tayaye. So Tayaye is, if you see in the name, Yas bin Kabisa al Tayaye. So this is a Tayaye tribe. So this it means that actually this Muhammad was belonging to a Tayaye tribe. And if we carefully look into this man, Iyas ibn Kabisa, how he rose, and all those things, then we can relate that how actually he is, he perhaps was the Muhammad. So this is what I was talking about. The Thomas the Prevester Chronicle in 640 AD. In the year 634, there were a battle between the Romans and the Romans of Byzantine. And the Mehmet. Mehmet is the Lakhmits of Muhammad. So Lakhmits is the place or the people who are no one but a Tayar tribe who had actually migrated from Yemen in second century to this place. So this Muhammad is belonging to the Lakhmits, or he's belonging to the Tayar tribe, the Palestine, 12 miles east of the Gaza. And this is the first reference which everyone gives about as a primary source for the existence of Muhammad. But this Muhammad is belonging to the Tayaye and the Lakmit people, which is far, far up than Makkah and Medina. So 610 AD becomes very interesting because, and in the 610 AD, we get to perhaps I'm sure that everyone will be aware about Elijah because this is a biblical name, and he is one of the prophet, and prophecy was made that someone named Elijah will come and try to save the people, right? And it's claimed to, and if I have to quote Malachi, behold, I will send you Elijah, the prophet, before the great and terrible day of Yahweh comes. He will turn the hearts of the fathers to the children and the hearts of the children to the fathers, lest I come and I strike the earth with a curse. And this name, what we see, Elijah, is exactly the name of this man, Kabisa, which we were talking about. Yas is Elias. Elias actually in the Hebrew becomes Elijah. So, which means, simply means, my God is Yahweh, right? So, my hypothesis is, rather now a theory, that this man was adopted. He was actually the Muhammad who did whatever was to be done, but he was doing in northern Arabia. And they choose, and this man had a nickname which was Muhammad. So they choose the Muhammad as a name but they didn't choose the Elijah, which was the first name, because if they would have chosen this name, this would have been a disaster. My God is Yahweh. It can't go with the new faith, which has to go against every faith which saw Yahweh as a God, because they wanted a new God. And so this is one big twist of 622 AD. So the king vanished as Muhammad appeared out of the cave of Hira, right? In an obvious remembrance of the cave of Eliza, where the ancient and the new prophet received the revelations from the angel Gabriel. Elijah did also receive the revelations from Gabriel in the cave Al Hira. So there is one more cave Al Hira there, and we have fabricated Al Hira this side. So in Al Hira he had received. So you can connect the dots now. One might be tempted to speculate that the succession may have fallen together with Heraclius' victory over the Persian in 622 AD. And 622 AD, if you recall, is the time when the Hijrah begins, right? Is 0 AH, Al Hijri. So this is the period of exodus of Muhammad. He goes from, this is where the exodus begins. And it becomes, the Islamic calendars begins from this year. But what is very interesting is that what you see here is one of the coin of the Heraclius. This coin is having the Heraclius emblem, 639 AD, Damascus Mint, BS year 17. But it means in 639 AD is the 17th year of the King Heraclius era. So it means that AH certainly means Augustus Heraclius, 17th year of, so 639 is exactly the 17th year of the Islamic calendar as well, because 622 plus 17. So this go all in a single line, right? So you see that how these things are grossly related. Now the Malkites or the Ghassanids are in Syria, where they see that Jesus is the man, but his spirit was the word of God. Jews were being force converted to the Chalcedonian creed. So these people who are being supported by the Byzantine are converting the Jews ferociously. So, and what actually the Malkites had advanced the Jewish spiritual middle ground in Syria, where they used to call it a very Jewish spiritual ground, and it was almost like a middle ground where they say that Jesus was a man, but his spirit was the word of God. Their creed would be reflected in John Bishop Niku Chronicles, where he says that the Godhead indeed is not converted into the manhood, nor the manhood into the nature, but the Word which has become flesh and become unchangeable, and no change can affect the Word. But the Word which has become flesh is one divine substance, while there is little doubt that, so while we see that there's a little doubt that John Bishop Niku rejected the Chalcedonian creeds, there's a lot of text which also shows this belief that he reached across to a spectrum of Christology, where he sees that Jesus was born from man as well. So he is contradicting, or rather, he is giving both the opinions. So it means that they had taken a middle ground, the Malkites in Syria. They refused to submit to the new orthodoxy, and were strong in modern. And they were very strong in the modern Syria and in the Western Arab Peninsula. According to John Bishop of Niku, the Jews on Byzantine territory were also to be forced converted to the Chalcedonian creed, lifting them to potential partner in an allied Judaic opposition. So you see that the whole context of the Islam is being created. So we see that anti-Semitism was on rise, and this is a quote which I have put from Quran, which talks about anti-Semitism. And so the idea of Jesus having both a human and a divine nature created a new dispute that would weaken the inner cohesion of the Byzantines just in the time to play into the hands of the advancing caliphate. If Jesus was both God and man, the question was whether his will was also of dual nature. Right. The result was a rebellion in the Egypt. So, what was happening that when this dual nature of Jesus was being talked about, so Egypt erupted into a rebellion, and even that a united stance of the church could not do much of a thing against it. So those churches were showing that we are united and all, but the people were not very happy with the idea. They were very rebellious in nature. That They can't accept Jesus in this way, and they can't accept Jesus in that way. So this had actually paralyzed the territory of Heraclius completely. So Heraclius territory was weakening day by day because of internal conflicts. Mm, So those who took the control of the various power fractions were the most dangerous extremist in nature. So whoever were working under the Heraclius were very extremist, and though the churches were collaborating and they were saying that everything is fine and all, but the people who were working with Heraclius were going on to persecute the people who was not agreeing to the idea of the church propagated by the Heraclius. So whatever Heraclius was propagating was not being accepted. So there were a lot of extremities. So it's said that there were a lot of terrorist organizations. I mean, it was the religious terrorist organization, literally, on a global scale, which were ready to kill or die for their faith in the fundamentalist version of God and Jesus on the either side. So, for example, if you see that Jerusalem was incurred in a sectarian killings in 615 AD, there were a lot of killing which happened in Jerusalem in 615 AD, and the Persian emperor seized the true cross and had tens of thousands of inhabitants in the holy city executed. The Jews were now homeless, expelled from Spain, Persia, Constantinople. With this geopolitical background, it seems likely that the Quran served as a doctrinal enforcement of Jesus, Ezra, and Adam being men, rather than constituting the foundation of a new and perhaps that time insignificant religion that targeted the Quraysh pagans that time, a tribe which was of sheer obscurity of which nothing is known. Actually, you don't know nothing about the Quraysh. We know a little about it, but they were being persecuted because of this idea of Jesus, Israel, and Adam. So Quran's authors express themselves obviously that the new scripture would not have been received well had it addressed the foreigners of the children of the Israel. So had they perceived the children of Israel as a foreigners, then Quran will not be received well. So they were kind of playing dual policies and the dual games, what you can say. The authors of the Quran also address that the recipient of the message has to know the Torah and the Moses laws. So one who knows the Moses law only is the receiver of the Quran. It's very clear from the Quran itself. So the difficulty to understand the Quran is lies in the fact that it has got negative messages which exist against the Judaic gods, but at the same time, it considers them the book of people. So it gives you a clue that though it is for the same people, but it's rejecting their own God or their own idea of divinity. So probably the best anti-doctrinal clarification in regards to Jesus can be found only in the Quran, if you ask me, and it represents exact response to the orthodox definition of the Christianity. So the Quran emerges as a continuum of the pool of Judeo-Christian sects that refuse to submit to the Chalcedonian or any Trinitarian notion. So, if you look at this particular surah, which actually we hope you all were able to read this surah, which is completely anti-Semitic in nature. It's from Quran 4.126 to 27, and this is from Quran 5.76, 5.77, and 5.79. Infidels now are they. So what we see, one thing is very interesting about the concept of the pagans that time. So uh, what happens is that this quoted verse declares that the spirit constitutes of word of God. The Malachite spirit went through John of Baptist to Jesus. To survive, they may have first been part of a Mohammedan alliance. Later, they must have become renounced their membership when it became clear that the Quraysh dynasty started to claim the new spiritual supremacy over the new Judaic pact. So, we see that whatever is running around is very much political, and it's very much in context of how the Jesus is gonna be perceived. And everyone who didn't agree to a particular idea was actually pagan. Paganism was not just limited to one who doesn't believe in the God or but it was very much like Orthodox Christian was very much pagan to Christian who believe in Arianism. So likewise, these people who were now starting to uh, form the new sect and see and have a new book, they were seeing the Orthodox Christian and the Arian also to some extent as the pagans. I just want to understand that if the things are really becoming clear or it's getting a bit too technical or anything which has been.
The thing is that if Islamic view of Jesus is similar to that of the Aryan view, it cannot be automatically assumed that Islam is a sort of variant of Aryanism or a survival of Aryanism on the Arabian Peninsula. I mean, if I get your argument right, maybe that's what you're arguing. Is that so?
It certainly isn't, if I would say that right now it's very much a hypothesis. And this is based on the ideas which I have collected by the reading of the literature around and the research which I have put across. And I do get a very strong belief and a faith that the contradiction in the ideas of Christianity, like how Arianism was perceiving Jesus as, it actually led to the creation of a new faith, which was Islam. And in fact, the Quran, if you look at Quran, so Quran essentially is a book which expects you to know all the literature of the past, like the Old Testament and New Testament. And if you're not aware of it, you can't, the receiver has to be aware of it. So I do get a feel that that is how it conspired and transpired at times, because we don't have any evidence for Islam per se. We don't have, because uh, there is no evidence at all for even Muhammad. There is no so the existence for Muhammad also comes from the sources like I spoke about the source of 634 AD where spoken that Muhammad is Tayyai. So here the Muhammad, this Tayyai people are also becoming to belonging to the this Muhammad is belonging to Tayyai people. So and these guys, this Muhammad, the Tayyai, is belonging to the Lakhmid region, right? So the Lakhmid people are finding a support from initially from the Persians, and to control the people of the Persia, the Heraclius, the king Heraclius, kind of appoints this man. The king of Persia appoints Iyaz bin Kabisa as a kind of a head of his Al Hira, and he gives him 30 villages, Homlet 5. He has given him. So he is trying to make sure that the conversions towards the Orthodox Christianity doesn't happen, or whatever is happening that side. And Lakhmids were definitely the people who were expelled from, who were living towards the Syria initially, and they were the people who were thrown out because they were not agreeing to the idea of the Chalcedonian principle, because the Arianism was a kind of bit different to what actually Chalcedonian idea was. So that's why I do have a belief that certainly it emerged out of the Arianism. So what we do recall is that there was always a conflict about the views of the Jesus and how he is to perceived, and people had different thought process. Aryans had a very different, altogether different thought process, and all it happened because initially there was a the Persian and the Byzantine were trying to just push forward. The Ghaznavis were being pushed forward by the Byzantines, while the Lakhmis were being pushed forward by the Persian side. So, and both the Persians and the Byzantines were kind of trying to use these people. And there was always a kind of unrest among them, the Ghaznavids and the Lakhmids. And Lakhmids eventually, started inclining more towards, because the Lakhmids were the people who had got a very strong faith that no, Jesus is a man, and they started adopting to the Persian customs, right? So the exchange of the Persian customs, perhaps that was the starting point of the how actually the, because they had the book, the idea given taken from the Old and New Testament, and now they had a custom. So what you see, if you see Islam today, it adopts a lot of things from Persian culture. It has and the book what they have, or the literature what they have, it's very Judaic in nature, right? Because it, as I said, it cannot be read by anyone who is not aware about the Judaic text at all. So yeah, so that is my strong condition. So moving forward with my slides, what we see is that Quran has got a lot of negativity to for the Jews and anyone who just subscribes to the Trinitarian notion of the Jesus. What happens is that the first new scripture which appears, it is kind of really the verses which had been picked about the anti-Semitism, or the verses which are picked about going against the Orthodox Christianity. It is actually nothing but can be translated to what exactly the jihad by the sword means in nature. So this has started happening. This is happening in terms of action, though it might not have been captured into the book completely. So what happens that the as the time passes, uh, the Quraysh dynasty started to claim the spiritual supremacy over the new Judaic pact. We see that gradually the Quraysh text had started picking it up very vehemently. And this theocracy possibly emerged out of Al Hira, Basra, or Cilicia Casiphon. Al Hira was one of the few Christian centers of Syro Aramic liturgical teachings as well. If anyone recalls that, what happened that in these places, there were liturgical teachings of the Syro Aramic Christian text used to happen. It means that the people were, laying laying the text out of the Old and New Testament and put in order and what needs to be read. And I said initially also that Quran is nothing but a liturgical book of the Old and the New Testament, right? So the Malkite middle ground in Syria was particularly prone to flip flopping, thus like breaking the alliances and undergoing double baptism, which seems to find the repeated parallels in Quran as well. So we see this happening. Ended on the Quranic foundation, the call to forfeiting power to Quraysh prominently stands out. We have seen it. The centrality of the Quraysh lineage for ultimate, the centrality of the Quraysh lineage is very important because why Muhammad was made to belong to the Quraysh, and though because one, if he wouldn't have been belonging to the Quraysh, then he would have gone to have belonged to the Elijah's family, which we spoke about, the Prophet Elijah. And what this would have done is that would have created a contradiction that though the Quraysh are the people who were adopting to the ideas first, and these are the people of the was following the new book, but this man was having a new actually comes from the Elijah family. We spoke about Yasmin Kabisa initially, so I didn't delve with the detail of who he was, how the Tayai migrated, and all those things, and why it has to be linked with Elijah. But the case is that this guy perhaps belonged to the Elijah community, Elijah's family, and if that would have happened, this would have given a case that Muhammad has got two different descendants, which possibly wouldn't have been possible. So the centrality of Quraysh lineage become very important, and we see a lot of problems with genealogical fixing because it somehow cannot be fixed. We don't have a lot of sources to talk about who exactly the Quraysh were. There's a lot of hypotheses that perhaps it comes from the Cyrus. It's also a term for the Quraysh. It has come from there, the King Cyrus. Or we see that as per the Chinese sources, actually the Quraysh are the people who are living in Persia and the Syria in the northern Arabia, and they belong to the Tayaya tribe. This is what few Chinese sources also say. So Chinese sources are saying that this guy belongs to the Quraysh belongs to Tayaya tribe. We have a hypothesis that the King Cyrus, the Quraysh comes from the King Cyrus. So there are lots of mixed ideas, but we don't see Quraysh anywhere going down the south. We see them wherever they may be, but they are up north, wherever they may be. So this idea that Quraysh were the Meccan people, it fails completely. It's somehow is non-acceptable. It doesn't go with how the sources lay in front of us. So we see that the because I'm talking about the Quraysh and the Muhammad. So we see that we don't have any sources which can actually place Quraysh in the southern belt. And this Tayaya tribe, which I was talking about in terms of Yas bin Kabisa, but this Tayaya tribe had actually migrated from the Yemen towards the northern Arabia in second century. So around 500 years before all these things are happening. And Thai were the very prominent people. They had controlled the territories. Like I told that this Yasmin Kavisa had got a lot of around 30 villages to control, and the idea was only to just push the rebellions, if I have to say. So that is why he was made that, and we saw that how in 610 AD, 622 AD, Augustus Heraclius had become very powerful. He had captured a lot of territories, and after 17 years, he had brought he had introduced a coin which bear a date 17 in 639 AD. So it gives you a lot of clue that how the story was being cooked up. So in the primary sources, so we see that actually the history of Islam and whole of our Middle East is highly jumbled up. So in the primary sources, we see that during the rise of Christianity and Islam, the word pagan is often used as a curse word for differing sects rather than the label for polytheist or belief of Roman, Persians, or Arab flavors. From a Muslim or Aryan Christian point of view, every sect that believed in anything other than a single and undivided Judaic God was actually pagan. They called Trinitarians associations and idolaters or also enemies of God as enemies of God, because they, according to John of Damascus, he has I have put the quote over here. John of Damascus, according to John of Damascus, they had declared Christ to be the Son of the God. Likewise, acquisitions of idolatry stems from the venerations of the cross as well. We see it happening various times. God is one. Say, we see that it's clearly said that God is one. Say not three. He has no son. This These core doctrinal issues are repeated so many times in Quran that it seems beyond doubt that Islam stands on its surface for rejecting Trinitarian doctrine. So undoubtedly, it is drawing inspirations from there. In contrast, the Quran mentions polytheism in sense of paganism only in two insignificant contemporary events, and otherwise exclusively in historic analogies. From an orthodox point of view, differing ideas that denied the Trinity would either be antichrist or godless for denying Jesus being God, or pagan in order to avoid the calling the enemy by the name. They would have looked at the Muslims as having embraced the doctrine of the beast, that is Muhammad. So this is the statements which are made by John of Damascus, that he is clearly saying that how these things happen. The first commandment in Exodus is quite clear. It says that you shall have no other gods before me. There are a lot of scholarly interpretations actually that attempt to explain away the Trinitarian difficulty with paganism, but these are not subject to discussion. But this right now is not very much subject to discussion. We won't be dwelling much deep into it. It is believed that Muhammad had merely chanced upon the pre-existing Jewish and the Christian scriptures, the text of the Old and New Testament. Hence, it is unclear what the religious affinities were and who accepted or refuted the teachings of Muhammad. We can't actually recall because he was just speaking the words from the Old and New Testament. I'm using the name Muhammad because, of course, there was someone Muhammad, not exactly what Quran says, but this guy was preaching something. So the Quran suggests that the early Muslims, in parallel to the follower of Jesus in the New Testament, had turned away from the new teachings after the Prophet's death. So Ibn Ishaq, if I have to quote Ibn Ishaq is the guy who writes the biography of Muhammad after 200 years, right? Portrayed Islam as evaporating. So he says that Islam was going away. Although this evidence is inadmissible because he clearly stated that relapse into the idolatry took place and that Judaism and Christianity rose again, both remaining unclear as to author's understanding. So it becomes so even by the Ibn Ishaq's testimony, it doesn't become very clear. If there had been a nascent Islam in 632 AD, say for example, if we say that it was existing, it turned into a scattered stillbirth. And it seems that the evolution of Prophet Muhammad's last sermon, the way of truth into the Quran, was interrupted for the same time being, if it ever made into the spiritual collection. Despite the presence of 10,000 witnesses to the last sermon, the collective memory seems to have forgotten which surah this might have been. Instead, multiple sectarian versions with competing messages are extant. As an analogy, Islam pretends as if was unclear where Jesus' sermon of the Mount would have to be found in the New Testament. So, in fact, the descriptions given in Quran also, and what the biographers of Muhammad also trying to say, it doesn't make very clear that the religion of Islam are existing. It is always justifying the fact rather that just a new sect of people had come who had rebellion thoughts about the existing orthodoxy of Christianity and things like that. So I will be. So actually, I was today supposed to even dwell into the who this man Yasmin Kapisa was, and why do I have a thesis that this man was Muhammad, and I also going to talk about who actually wrote the Quran and how the book came into being, and what is the story of Makkah and what is the black stone. So these subjects which we will be dealing with in the next session, so I will try to make it even more precise. So we were almost into the end that how actually Islam reached, but we will take this up in the next session that quite freshly. So I'll talk about how actually Islam emerged after these disturbances among the Christian sects, and we'll talk about Muhammad, who this man Muhammad is, and we'll also talk about what exactly this Quran is, how it was written, who wrote it, and of course Makkah.
Good evening, Mr. Abbas, and it's a wonderful academic uh, discussion. For us to understand, much of it was little difficult. Yet, I would really, what I understand out of the whole thing is they were so well entwined. All these three religions. I mean, whether they were entwined or they were loggerheads, we can see that. So I was just thinking that if you would put up a very modern view of the present religions later on sometimes.
Yeah, sure, we can do it some other time. As you said, we can definitely do a comparative study of how the things are happening. And I have always perceived as the religion of the Abrahamism to have emerged out of the political wills. There was not much of a spirituality related to the idea. Spirituality was always an added factor. And of all, Islam was definitely a faith which actually, in my opinion, didn't exist till 7th of the century. And it started, though the idea was being cooked up since 4th century, but it emerged into a full-fledged religion. And it was the Abbasids who formulated it in a very right and not right in an appropriate way how the Islam needs to be spread, or the kind of the you submit to someone. This was brought out by Abbasids, in my opinion, because Abbasids had actually burned down all the literature of the Umayyads as well. We have the records for it. And Abbasids were the one who were just manufacturing hadiths, like how weapons are being manufactured during the war. More the war, the more the hadiths were produced. And and at the same time, this story of this bin Qasim of the Sindh also comes from there. It was commissioned to for the first time we hear of bin Qasim in 895 AD, or rather about the story of the Sindh, which is 180 years after the alleged strike by the 17-year-old juvenile boy, or whatever, a teen, even because even the Makkah was not existing. So all this Makkah thing was also fabricated, and so Islam of all is the one of the most the faith which is based on a lot of ideas which are false to nature, which are not very true, and a lot of fiction is associated with it. Though, of course, Christianity and the Jews have got certain substance. Though, yes, even existence of Jesus can be questioned. It is questioned. I don't believe that Jesus existed.
It's of course very good. I mean, it's very important that apart from the criticism of the Islam as Muslims believe it, which for India was pioneered by Sitaram Goel, that now the criticism of Islam as history sees it, which is very different from how Muslims see it, that is also brought into India. So I think this is a great initiative. And so I thank Abbas for his effort. As for, things that surprise me, well, first of all, the etymology of Quraysh being related to Kyros or Cyrus. You see, I'm surprised. I never thought of this, but actually, it's perfectly possible. It's etymologically quite sensible. It's not far fetched at all. Then, as for the word pagan, there I have a little problem. You see, to say that everybody, including Christians who didn't believe exactly in an orthodox fashion, were all called pagan. That's not what I thought I knew. But I mean, maybe, I can learn. But you see, pagan is a Roman term. It's not in the Eastern Mediterranean, but in the West. And it dates, as far as I know, to the time when Christianity was expanding. So in the cities, you had preachers who collected crowds and preached to them Christianity and converted them. Whereas in the countryside, this preaching was much less effective, more difficult to organize and so on. So there you still had the believers in the old religion called village bumpkins, because that's the effective meaning of pagan. So people who were not with the new fashion. And whereas a Christian who did not strictly follow the church, like for instance the Arian Christians, or the Melkite Christians, or the Coptic Christians, they were called heretics. That's a Greek term that also existed in Greek much. Now, in the case of Islam, you see, for the church fathers, this was also, you see, unlike the polytheists, this Islam was also not strictly pagan. It was heretic, because they saw that the Muslims were to some extent Christians. Namely, they believed in Jesus, they believed in his virgin birth, they believed in his second coming at the end of time. They did not believe in his resurrection or in the fact that he was the Son or the incarnation of God, but nevertheless, they had something of Christianity. And so from the church's viewpoint, they were like lapsed Christians, Christians gone astray. So whereas Hindus are fully, undoubtedly pagans, in the case of Islam, it is rather heretic than pagan. And so that's why I'm surprised to hear this talk about the word pagan. There, I mean, it's a very minor point in the very useful discourse of Abbas. But anyway, that's my first thought about it. I wonder what he has to say about this.
Thanks a lot. Yes, sir. It's of course, a comment made by you is going to be of great importance for whole thing. Hearing from you is a big thing, first and foremost. Yeah, and yes, I do agree to your point that pagan is a very generalistic term which I use. I would have used a heretical term, and that would have made much more sense. So it will go more in the context. So I completely agree to it. There's no denial about it. Thanks a lot, sir.
Okay.
Now, going by even the traditional biographies that are available, it is very clear where this Christian influence came on the Prophet of Islam, because his own uncle was a Christian. We read in the Orthodox biographies. So, is there really a need to postulate some kind of an Aryan connection when, in fact, we know from the Orthodox biographies itself that, first of all, Arabia was a multicultural society with probably a pagan majority, and secondly, that there were at least one mixed family where there are some people who are Christian and some people who are clearly pagan. So, is there any reason to bring in the Sasanian Byzantine conflict and then the Arian heresies and so on in order to explain this?
So, first of all, my submission to whole of a thing in crux is that my study say that there was no Muhammad, and the story of he being influenced by any Christian uncle is also a very cooked up story, because his biographies, if you go by a classical notion, or I say SIN, that is standard Islamic narrative, what I call sin. Based on that, that is what you are trying to tell. And as per sin, so where do we get this sin from? What is the source of our thing in the sin? So our sources are actually, the first source is definitely the work of Ibn Ishaq. So if I just dwell a bit in the classical story of it for the people to get it, in 570 Muhammad is born. In 610 he meets the Jibril or Gabriel, whatever you call it, in the Hira cave. 610 to 622 he received the Meccan revelation. In 621 the incidence of Miraj happens, where he goes to the seven heavens and brings the five prayers. And this is where the Al-Aqsa Mosque also comes into play, and Dome of Rock, what's all happening in the Israel right now. This is the place where. So in 622, this is the point of Hijrah. 622 to 32, it's the Medina revelation. 630, he conquered Makkah. It said peacefully, but it was whatever. 632, he died. There are few also says that he was died of poisoning. And we are told that we have four caliphs: Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, and Ali. Now I tell all these things are bunkum. And because, including all these four caliphs, why this is bunkum? Because where do we get? We need to have first source about it. The first source we get is 765 AD, when Ibn Ishaq wrote Siratul Rasulullah, and 833 Ibn Hisham writes Siratul Rasulullah. Now Ibn Hisham has written this text. Ibn Hisham says that he got the reference from the work of Ibn Ishaq, but no one has seen the work of Ibn Ishaq. We see the work of Ibn Hisham, which was written in 833. 833 is around 201 years after the alleged death of Muhammad. Then we got the first hadith, which is written by Al-Bukhari. It's written in 870, and again 870 means 240 years. So for 240 years, people were sleeping, and suddenly they wake up to know that yes, there was a prophet 200 years back. So let's write a story about him. In 923, we get the work of Al-Tabari, who writes tafsir and taqrib. So on and on. And all these things are happening during when Abbasids have become powerful. In whole of our literature fraternity, we have got two genres. One is fiction, one is a historical fiction. I see the story of Quran as a historical fiction, in my opinion, because it's based on a bit even on lower ground of it, where the story has been adopted from however the thing was happening. So when we see that everything is flawed, so when I was talking about questioning that first reference to Muhammad also appears in a coin which was issued by Abdul Malik in 690s, which is happening after 60 years. Then I was given a reference that it's not after 60 years, but the first time Muhammad was spoken about in 634, in 640 AD. In 640 AD, I spoke about that reference. When in 634, it is said that Muhammad the Tayyaye goes on a war 12 miles away from Gaza. This is the first primary source which talks about Muhammad, which is exactly dated in the period. Now, where are these Tayyaye people? These Tayyaye people are definitely in the northern Arabia. So when this Muhammad is belongs, so why will I refer to the Quranic version? Rather, I will have to refer to the version which are exactly written in the same period and also talking about the Muhammad at the same time. And all this text then take me back to what I was saying. That is how it's related, because it's very important to understand that how exactly Quran, like for example, I'll give you a fair bit of amount of the Quranic text which we have found. So one of a very famous manuscript of the Quran, which is there, is the Sana manuscript, right? So Sana is a place where in Yemen where this manuscript of Quran is kept, a few part of it. So the carbon dating took it from a range of around 300 years before the alleged birth of Muhammad to to 100 years after the alleged death of Muhammad. So this text might have been even before the birth of Muhammad, because carbon dating is a range. Even the oldest date can be correct one, or the latest date can also be the correct one. So it is a high probability, and perhaps this would have been written by Sumerian. Who knows? Some accounts were being written. So all this, and in fact, if I just go back to one of the oldest fragment of manuscript of Quran, which is found in Birmingham Library, and they say that BBC had done lot of who Allah, that we found the oldest Quran, but this is just one page this side, one page that side. So this is not complete Quran. This is 3%, right? This is not a complete manuscript. Now, when the carbon dating of this was also done, interesting, this also takes you around 60 years, 20 years before the alleged birth of Muhammad, and 10 years after the. So this range also. So how can Quran happen before the birth of Muhammad? So it means that the Quran which is being shown to you related to Quran is perhaps not the correct one. Something else is looking around. So when I started looking at the primary sources, that led me to just deviate my study to some other direction, and that direction made me to realize that, or rather venture out that, hey, how did this thing Islam got to evolve? Because there was nothing called Islam till 7th century, because there is no mention of Makkah before Banjatina Arabica. This is a document which talks about Makkah for the first time in 741 AD, and we find the Makkah on any map for the first time in 900 AD. It takes 300 years, around 250 years after that we find Makkah on the map. If Makkah was exactly the mother of civilization, as the Quran says, so it has to be on the map. We need to have some archaeological references of, if it's again a subject matter of discussion that how old is our civilization. But we have instances of archaeological evidences of human civilization in India from 6,000 years, right? So if Makkah has to be the mother of civilization, it has to be at least 8,000, 9,000 years old. But we don't have any archaeological proof of any. So the whole Quran, or whole of a narrative which comes to us, is highly fraudulent. And with this lot of fraudery which has happened, then we need to find an alternative thing. So that's why we are just going back to basic. Maybe that we are starting to rewrite the whole history of Islam. I don't know how it will turn out, but this is how I am perceiving it as, because we don't have any correct text available.
So my question would be, so according to your theory, if you say that there was no Muhammad, so how did the Quran existed, and after that, how did the Islam got to the political power? Means how it go to the conversion? I didn't understood that.
So perhaps I went in flow with the emotion where I directly said that there was no Muhammad. I say that there was a Muhammad. There are two Muhammads, and there are multiple Muhammads. I'll tell you how. Because as per the Hebrew language, there was also a term called mammoth, right? And the mammoth literally means a powerful office. So, and we find this text during the Umayyad period written in Hebrew language, which talks about mammoth. There's a mammoth who is controlling the thing. So perhaps it was an office as well. It might be the case. When I say there was a Muhammad, of course, when you get inspired from a story, so you need to have a character over there. So my character in this case is Ilyas ibn Qabisa. From whom whole of a story of the Quran has been inspired from, and a new narrative was written based on that character. So there was one man, Inesri, and this man, Ilyas ibn Qabisa, actually nickname was Muhammad. His main name was Ilyas, which actually means Eliza, which means Yahweh is my God. Had that name been taken, it would have been a disaster to Islam, because it has to reject that God and has to bring a new God, Allah. This thing Allah also has got a very different story. So we will not dwell into it right now. But so for that reason, yes, Muhammad was inspired from certain characters. There would have been multiple Muhammads. Like and interestingly, Quran 93 times invokes Jesus, and 4 times talks about Muhammad. And Muhammad is a position. To be very clear that it's a designation. It's always about anyone in the Arabian language from that time. Anyone who is powerful or the blessed one can be Muhammad. So that is how it goes. And Quran was certainly a compilation of the works which people could find here and there, and just they were compiled together. And in my opinion, the larger work started happening from Umayyad leader. Actually, he was Umayyad, Abdul Malik. Abdul Malik was the man for the first time. If you can just go back to see my earlier talk also, where I've shown how the transformation happened. For the first time on his coins, we see the Christian cross. Next time we see him appearing and him being compared to an dearest one of the God, which is supposed to be the Muhammad. So he has seen himself as the most powerful one. In the next coin, we see the mention of Muhammad, and then he builds a structure called Dome of Rock. Right now, it's in the news because of Israel-Palestine brawl or fight or whatever. So this Dome of Rock is the place where this Abdul Malik built, but this is the place exactly from where Muhammad flew on the horse named Burak to the seventh heaven. He got in there, and he met Moses there. He first goes to the God, and God gives him a bunch of prayers. When he comes to Moses, Moses said, "Hey, it's way too much. Go reduce the prayer." Then he goes up and down, and then he finally comes up with the 5 prayers. And then Moses said, "Oh, it's fine. Now you can go back, and it's 5 prayers." So that's why you have five times prayer. So he comes back, and so that place is remarkable for this mirage, the act of mirage, that the Muhammad going and all those things. But Dome of Rock doesn't talk of that incident at all, but it talks of this incident is being spoken in the mosque which is later just adjacent to it, which was built 17 years after that. It's Al-Aqsa Mosque. Al-Aqsa Mosque. So in that mosque, but the place which is claimed to has a claim of Muhammad flying is this Dome of Rock. What it talks about, Dome of Rock has got the first Quranic verse written, right, the oldest. And this verse is again trying to demean Jesus, is trying to say that Jesus is not the Son of God, he's not godly, is a condemnation of Jesus. And there was a reason why it was built higher than the Christian the Christian monument, which is just some distance from there. And it was built at a higher position, and it was inspired from that Christian structure itself completely in terms of the plan and everything. So what this guy was trying to do, trying to make a political dominance over the Byzantines. It was not about Christianity or anything, but dominance over empire, that is the Byzantine Empire. So that's why it was built at a higher structure, and that's why condemnation of Jesus. And then when this thing happens, and this verse of the verse which is written over there is longer than the verse which is there in Quran. So it means that what is longer? The original one will be longer. So what is built in 691 is the original, and what is written in Quran is actually the newer thing. So Quran definitely happened after 691 AD. So yes, it was just a political move, and that's how it transpired, in my opinion and reading so far.
Before I ask my question, I will say that the talk was excellent, but I am worried about Abbas that there may not be any fatwa issued against him in India. So my worry. My question is that you said that it is a fraud about Islam. Now, if that is so, how to meet the challenge of this product Islam in India? If you cannot answer this question now, kindly do it in your talk later in June. Thank you.
I'll just give a very short answer on this question. That I was of a belief that Islam can't be changed long back. Now I have a belief that Islam can be changed, and I come from a belief that Islam has been changing, and Islam had different versions. And you will be surprised to know that the Quran got canonized completely only in 1985. It's just 3 years older to me, right? So before that, there were multiple versions of Quran, and the Hafs version of Quran, which was adopted as a final version. And before that, the canonization happened in 1924-25 in Cairo, Egypt. It happened because every student in the Islamic studies were writing different answer to the one question related to Quran. So when they found that there is so much discrepancy, they wanted a standard Quran. So it was standardized in 1925. So when this standardization happened, it later on, after 60 years, impressed the king of Saudi Arabia so much. And then he said that now this Hafs Quran will be the canonized Quran for whole of the world. So before that, there were multiple versions. We saw that Abbasids modified the idea of Islam completely, taking over with the Umayyads, and Umayyads literature were burned down. And also we saw that we have, in the last talk I clarified, there were multiple Kaabas. There were not one Kaaba. There were multiple Kaabas based on how people want to worship and the situation. And the earlier Kaabas till 813 AD used to face towards Petra, then to nowhere, and then to. So I see that there has been transformation. Islam has changed. So that's why I have a belief that if the historical context of Islam can be put forward, and then people can, if look at it from right now in India particularly, we saw that we have mostly gotten into the humiliation factor, or at times just picking a part of our literature which kind of says that this is wrong with the faith or something. We have not hit that or rather we have not captured the historical moments which is something. So when I was given the writing of 634 AD as a reference for Muhammad, you are saying that there is no Muhammad. Hey, here is a reference, and that came out as a boon to me. And then I started looking at the Syriac text that this Muhammad belonged to Tayy, and the whole narrative itself changed. So I'm using exactly the evidences given by them to really find out who this man Muhammad, or what this faith Islam essentially is. So when we just don't go into the acts of blasphemy or the things like that, but we just pick the if someone wants to worship, now my opinion is that if someone sees divinity in something, that's okay. You do it. I'm not going to go into that. What should be right? What should be wrong. But my job as a person who researches is to bring forth the night narrative. Let us put the fact, and then we'll see what the reaction is. That should be the path for me, and I believe it should be for everyone.
Thanks, Abbas, for such an excellent talk. And that reminds me, your research based on a theory that Muhammad wasn't existing. Okay, that reminds me, somewhere I had read long back that even the Jesus also is a fictitious character. Even the photos of Jesus which we see today, it's the photo of son of Pope Benedict 16th or 16th Pope Benedict, probably, if I recall it correctly, the Cesar Borgia. Do you see any similarity? The way these two, Christianity and Islam, they both are getting propagated, and they both expanded throughout the world.
As I said earlier, also, I have completely seen the Abrahamic faith as a political forces. They just like how Islam emerged. See why they came up with a new prophet, new God, and everything, because having power that time was about two things: you get new religion and you get a new prophet and a god. There were three. Everyone had Trinity, if I be precise. Their Trinity was religion, you bring the faith. Then second aspect of Trinity was you get a prophet, and the third aspect was you get some new god. And that is how it all happened. And every faith was following the same principles, because the Byzantines, who were the Christians, wanted to become powerful, wanted to remain powerful than the Jews. So they came up with a new idea. And if you go back to the history, if you see that, in fact, Christianity also was about the political dominance, because the people of that era were certainly, I won't use the term dogmatic, but certainly they were too deeply engrossed into the idea that some divinity will help you out. Some divinity is always there to stand by you and do something good for you, and the things will change, whatever the disaster may be. And so this emotion always acted in favor of the powerful one to bring in a new god or a new prophet. Similarly, but as far as the Jewish sect are concerned, I do feel that there was a bit of differences. Of course, it also emerged. Most of the faith, you must have a certain amount of faith for a certain amount of fiction. But what I read about the Jews particularly is that when the territory where this Israel and the Palestine is there, so This was called Canaan. The place of this place was altogether, and the Canaanites were the people who were residing in that place. So it's around 1200 BC when these people just started adopting a new faith. First came the Yahwahism, when Yahweh was one of the god in that locality in the region. Then from Yahwahism, it translated to become, yes, of course, they were also radical and fanatic, but their idea was not for the political growth. It was completely out of looking at the spiritual, but on the contrast, as more it moved with the further faith, it was all about the power and the dominance and how to bring other down.
I have been following regularly your threads also on Twitter. My question is that we have a Sira and Hadith also, and I have read the encyclopedia of Sira. There are a lot of characters and a lot of associates and lots of historical, so-called historical events. Don't you think that this is too much of a fictionalization to put everything in order, like Al-Badr, Treaty of Hudaybiyah, and so many characters that appear during the so-called life of Muhammad? Do you think they're all fictionalized?
In my opinion, first of all the four caliphs are the fiction, because we don't have any primary sources for it. Because unless history is all about admitting the thing which has got the source. History cannot be based on just a belief and a faith. So we don't have any evidence for the Muhammad of Quran, like what you see Muhammad in the Quran. We don't have any evidence for it, because per se maybe that as I said, that Quran talks about Muhammad only 4 times, Jesus 93 times. It might be the case that perhaps it's addressing the Jesus itself. Who knows? It also can be the case. So, and we don't know anything about what Umayyad's literature was, because the Umayyad literature was burnt down by the Abbasids. So we actually do not have any clue what happened in this gap of from 6th century, or rather 7th century, or 6th century, let's consider, because Muhammad was born that time, to the period of the Abbasids. We have complete blackout. And we don't, that's why you don't have a single, I always put this challenge to anyone to give me one Arabian source which talks about Islam, which talks about the Muhammad between this period, before 691 AD. We absolutely have no sources. And what is most interesting is that, the bizarre claim comes that, we have the Quran, which was canonized by Uthman, the caliph. And what he did, he saw that there's a various version of Quran which is available every day here and there. So to Western Rite, he canonized it. He brought all of them together and burnt the remaining, and then he distributed in the various territories. He sent it across. But we don't have any reference for the Uthman as well, that whether he existed or not. So because we don't find the Uthman's Quran at all. Right, because the Qurans are having. So if Uthman had canonized the Quran, then why in 1924 AD people in Cairo had to bring one standard version of Quran, which was the Hafs Quran, and this guy Hafs was actually work was not considered very credible. His version of Quran long back when he. So there were multiple versions of Quran. Not in India. I'm not sure whether we'll find multiple versions of Quran in India or not, for many reasons. But if we just go, in fact, in Europe as well, we can find a lot of, if you ask for a book of Quran, you will be asked, which version do you want? They really have the versions of Quran. So and as for Hadith has got a very interesting story. That one thing is that whoever wrote the Hadith in the mass, most of them were related to some of the slaves, right? Some were down the parent side, someone would be slave, or he himself would be slave. So the writing of Hadith was a redemption. So when this redemption, so whoever would write more of it would be redeemed much more earlier. And what we see, when you have got a spiritual book, it is not supposed to humiliate the man, the primary man, but Hadith does humiliates Muhammad to a great extent. And this humiliation quotient was actually added by the writers of the Hadith for a major reason, to keep the thing very entertaining. It was like an X factor of the book, to keep the people encouraged. And you will be surprised to know that the first Hadith which Mr. Bukhari wrote around 230 years after the alleged demise of Muhammad, he was given some around 6 lakhs of the Hadith, right? And out of 6 lakh, he chose to write around 7,000. So around 98 2% of the hadith was registered by Mr. Bukhari. Who told Mr. Bukhari after 200 years, that this hadith is wrong? Muhammad didn't say it. And he said that what I found wrong, I just removed it. So who was the author? So this whole hadith is completely fabricated. We even have a tale that parts of Quran was eaten up by the sheep. We don't have any standard narrative, or rather very historical narrative around the Islamic literature, to be very precise. That's why they are to be doubted.
Abbasji, namaste. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed the session. Although I must confess that I am not a student of humanities, so there were a lot of historical references to people, place, and event that I couldn't relate to. So I'm going to, go through this video once again and read about these events, and probably I'll have a better idea. I have a question, and I'm so sorry if it sounds more like a hypothesis. So today people say that when you look at Hamas, they say that Hamas was a creation of Israel, to curb the Arab influence, especially when it comes to Palestinians. And a lot of people relate to it. And again, this could be a conspiracy theory wherein they say that when Islam rose, of course, Islam did not rise because of spirituality or it had any element to give it to people. It was more of a power struggle within Abrahamic fractions. But it says that somehow Jews were the one who weaponized Islam in the beginning, and later on it became Frankenstein's monster, just the way Hamas has become a monster today for Israel. Do you have you come across any such thing, or do you think it's just a conspiracy and should be rubbished?
No, I don't think it's a conspiracy, because actually the Jews were. So see, when I spoke about different school of thoughts of Christianity, I was talking about it because I wanted to establish that how Jesus was being perceived and how they were actually against each other with the swords in the hand. What it does is that one who is perceiving, forget that they are Christian. They are having a view of the Jesus, what the current Muslim has it, and he has got a sword. He is ready to wage the jihad. So what does it mean? That the idea of because the first version or the first verse of Quran, which is found in Dome of Rock, 691 AD, is also about condemning, or rather doing the humiliation to the Jesus, right? So what it does means that this idea was existing 300 years before that. Yes, and the Jews' idea does subscribe to the notion that which is against the Orthodox Christianity. It doesn't go hand in hand with that. So when that, and of course, when a bunch of Jews saw that the Byzantines are getting powerful, they are being persecuted, and I spoke about in the middle that there were certain Jews which started doing the revolt, but they were crushed in the time of Justinian, and they were always looking at the possibilities of picking a weapon. And if you see that there are a lot of tradition which has been taken from the Judaism, it is not completely. Though the works and literature is very common to Christianity and the Jews, like Old Testament, and for them there is a New Testament. So of course, when the text is being put across, right, and the tradition is the Jews. So what do you say? They did it from Christianity or the Jews? You have no clues about it. It's just a merger of all the things which were there around, just as a position of the powerful ones of that locality or that particular large geopolitical reason.
As you said that the Battle of the Ten Kings, the Sharajne War, and then they migrated outside. So I've also heard theories of Jews originating from India. So the god Yahweh, can it be a derivative of Shiva from here? Because they could not pronounce Hindu, they said Hindu, her. So Sir turns into, and then it becomes Yahweh, and then because even his consort is followed by many other Sumerians and all those. So that is something that it's a hypothesis I wanted to just understand, because we find 7,000-year-old Shivlings originating in Turkey also.
There certainly can be a possibilities of linkages to our civilization, because I see a very strong link with the Mediterranean and in fact the whole Persian belt and whole of a belt. In fact, in parts of more towards Russia as well, I see a lot of strong connection with our civilization, and our world was certainly a bit different from what we see today right now. and also the kind of description which we find in the Ramayana, right? What Sugriva has given while he was explaining the whole of a geography for his Vanasena to go here and there. So once we start connecting the dots, then we will see that we did had idea of those places. How will we have idea of those places? We would have idea of those places. I'm not subscribing to the idea that we had flying things and all right now, because I don't find it very very much proven. So I will not pick this. But this certainly means that there were certain means of transportation. So maybe that the people were walking down, there were the certain kind of so people were the guys from our side, that is who wrote the Ramayana, would have definitely seen that what's happening there. So there must have been certain colonization. So it might I have not read, not worked on the Yavai, so I cannot comment precisely on it whether he was Shiva or not. But certainly there was a very strong influence, because the first migration is from people come towards India, and from the India people migrate towards outside. And what happened then from outside again inside, and that is how the things happened. But what happened that people missed out the first part, that Indians migrated, but they picked the second part, which is the migration this side. So that's why the whole bunch of the people linked Avestans also in a very other way. Like, yes, Avesta is connected to the Rig Veda, but it's other way around. It went from this side to that side, not from that side to. So I see that there must have been a possibility, and something might just come up. I believe that it take at least 20, 30 years to establish, if at all some relations are there.